would like to welcome everyone to this episode of the Scholar Spotlight brought to you by Global Policy Next Generation. And I'm delighted to have talented Milan Babić here with me, transcending the time and geographic distance between Canada and Netherlands there. So Milan is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Maastricht University, and he is an incoming assistant professor of global political economy at Roskilde University. Am I pronouncing it right, Milan?
Yes. Good.
Good. His work examines the transition of the global political economy from a neoliberal world order towards a post-neoliberal global order. I'm really delighted that, Milan, you were able to join us. So thank you so much for being here with us. Would you like to start the conversation by giving us an elevator pitch about everything you've done in terms of your research?
Okay, yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. And I think, an elevator pitch about everything I've done would probably take too much time. But what I'm currently focusing on is, as you said, the transition from a so-called neoliberal to a so-called post-neoliberal global order. And that sounds pretty abstract. So what I'm concretely doing is I look into three streams of my research, which is, state-led investment. That's the first part. That's also building on my PhD research. So, where are states invested? How are they invested? What are strategies? What are political reverberations of this type of investment? The second one is, the liberal order and its crisis as such, right? It has to do with geoeconomics, with all types of other phenomena that we see. And the third one is decarbonization also of states as owners at the moment, but also in a broader sense. So how do we get from basically to net zero, if you want to use that word, in different realms of political, if you want. So these are the three things that I'm working on currently.
This is really interesting and really interchangeable in a way. You can borrow ideas from the one to the other because it's really neat research project you have there. How did you get started on it? What brought you, especially, you started on it at your PhD level, right? You mentioned that in your questionnaire. So what gave you the idea to focus on those interesting issues and issue areas?
Yeah, so for my PhD research specifically, so I come from a, let's say, critical IP background, I guess. That's how you would call it probably. In my master's, and I was looking at all sorts of theoretical things, and I wanted to do a bit more, let's say, empirically grounded research. And I came into a group that was very interdisciplinary in my, how would you call it? Like, it's not really a lab, but it's a research project with several people. And there, actually, I don't even exactly remember how I got to my PhD topic, which is, state-led investment. But I think it was a mixture of, previous interest in state theory in general, and then, a lot of data and a lot of questions that I and other people in the group had about the reconcentration of state ownership in about 2015-16 that was. So that was a big deal. If you remember, there were discussions about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, rising in the global economy, about China in specific and what that means. And there were also a lot of really, not well-written books, or I mean, they were well-written, but, they were sort of superficial, let's say, more, American foreign policy oriented, that were talking about the so-called state capitalism. And I wanted to understand that better, right? So what does it really mean when states rise as owners? And so that's how I got my PhD research started. And the rest then just came along, right? So I had an interest in issues of global order since I was a student, and I tried to combine it a bit with my PhD research. And the last topic, the decarbonization stuff, basically came up because, of course, state ownership is, it's very variegated, if you want, but it's also very strongly present in fossil fuels, right? And in global hydrocarbon production. And so that was something that I wanted to do in my PhD research, but never had really the time to do that. So I started that in my postdoc. And so basically that's how it hangs together, I guess.
A good way to approach it. And you're really pushing the boundaries in a way. Your pieces are really pull in the gaps and close the gaps that we have had in the literature. This is really important. And thinking about you starting out what would be the advice that you would give early master students or those in their early stages of their PhD? How should they approach the whole program? What was the most rewarding from all of that experience for you?
Question about the advice. So I'm always a bit hesitant to give advice, but and so that, of course, that's also, up to different persons approach it differently. But I think it's also a bit tricky to give general advice because people, I mean, if you want to do a PhD, there are, at least in Europe, there are like 25 different ways or so, or probably 250. But there are a lot of different ways of doing that, right? So you can either apply with your own project, get funding for it. You can do it without funding at all, which I wouldn't recommend. You can, apply to research projects like I did, that open up a PhD position. You can also apply to programs, to schools, to open positions. So there's a variety of ways you can approach it. And depending on what it is that you end up doing or applying to, different rules apply, right? So it's sort of difficult to give general advice. So I would say, if you, maybe that's a tip that's related to this. So if you want to know what sort of possibilities there are to get into academic research on the PhD level, I would recommend going on Twitter and following the people, because I mean, you're in a specific field, right? So you know a few names, and I would just look on Twitter for them and just start following those people and see, and their networks, of course, and then see what comes up. I think that's maybe something that is useful for, master students that want to get an idea, okay, what sorts of possibilities are there, right? And then you'll figure out quickly that, there are different types of positions. There are also probably different strings attached to certain projects, and somewhere you have more freedom to do whatever you want, and in others you're more, streamlined in a way. And so I think Twitter is a good way to start looking for, what is of interest. And that's something that I just figured out recently, right? Otherwise, yeah, I mean, if you're interested in stuff, just, email people, right? So if you want to do a PhD in a field and you have questions, if you're lucky, people will answer. And yeah, that's a good way to start, I guess.
Actually, this is really good feedback, Milan, because first, coming from North America, we apply to universities, so we don't have projects. We come up with projects. So this is really interesting for those applying from North America, that there is an alternative way of doing things in Europe. And then emailing people, following Twitter, this is excellent. I think this is so helpful.
I also have to add that I don't have a lot of experience in applying, because I applied to exactly one position and I got this. So that's, I think, also very different from the North American experience, let's say, where you really apply, to a bunch of schools, let's say, or programs. So yeah, it really depends, I think, right? So in that sense, I mean, I didn't even have a plan when I started, right? I just applied, and then I got lucky. And so, yeah, but I think there are certainly more systematic ways of approaching this.
Of course,
yeah, they're rewarding. Yeah, so that's a good question, right? Because you do your work and then you don't really pay a lot of attention to these things. And then when they come, I don't know, if you publish something or you win something or something. I mean, of course, that's probably the case in every job, right? So if you get something that rewards your previous work, that's always good. But I mean, specifically about academia, I think for me, the most rewarding is when I find out stuff. I know if you look at data, or if you try to understand something really hard and it takes a while, and then when you have this eureka moment, I think that's something really cool, because I mean, you don't really, I mean, that's a short-lived feeling also, because then a lot of other problems open up. But it's really this, this feeling that you see a connection somewhere, right? And then you have a way of approaching something that was really hard to approach. I think that's something cool, and that I hope that never goes away, right? I had it a lot during my PhD, right, when it clicked. So I think that's the most rewarding, when, at least for me, in my daily work.
I absolutely agree. I think finding the last bit of information that opens those doors is like, oh my God, you actually hit the point in a way. Going back to your question, I really found it interesting when you said that your research is most important to you because it addresses all of the concerns, the life changes, the well-being of present and future generations. This is really broad, Milan. But tell us more. What is really so critical about? Yes, we need to address those grand challenges. We need to incorporate that. This is really important. How do you approach it?
I think in political economy, but I guess in international relations, international politics research in general, we tend to have, I wouldn't say necessarily abstract discussions, but you deal with things that are, bigger than the everyday life of people. And I know that there are a lot of everyday politics perspectives within the field, and I exclude them, I guess, from this general statement. But I think that, we tend to, to talk about big politics and big structural developments and historical processes. And while you do that, I guess everybody had that at some point where you think, okay, but why does it actually matter, right? So except for the science itself or the discipline itself, you have your 15 people that are interested in the same thing as you, and they found this probably super cool, but what about the rest of society? And so within my own work, at some point I realized that, okay, might be that you talk about abstract and these like longue durée processes, if you want, but at the same time they matter a lot for people, right? So in the written interview I described whatever, the end of World War II, or these sort of historical world order changes that influence a lot of people at the same time in either very positive or very negative ways, right? And also, of course, differently, right? So different groups of people are affected differently by these big structural changes. And I think that matters in the end, right? So it matters to understand global change, and also to intervene is too much, right? Because we're more observers, let's say, or most of us are more observers and have an analytical eye on that. But I think it's important, for humanity, if you want, or for global civil society, or however you want to call it, to understand that these processes are happening and that they have consequences for a lot of, or for millions and billions of people. And I think that's something that's not super rewarding, I would say. Like if you think like, oh, I found whatever, a vaccine for a global pandemic or something, is probably much cooler. But it gives you a sense of, okay, that it's not totally abstract and totally removed from the everyday life of people, what you're doing. And then another question is, of course, how you translate it, right? And I'm not sure if I'm really good at that, or if I know anyone who's really good at. There are, of course, people who are really good at that. But I guess for yourself, it's or for myself at least, it's important to understand that even though something might seem very much removed, it is in the end not so much, right? It is. Exactly. People care if, I don't know, people like Trump gets elected or re-elected or not, right? That has material consequences for people, right? So in that sense,
Absolutely right. We are informing, right? We're informing about what's going on. We are trying to help. We're sometimes trying to propose solutions. When we get to the policy implication stages of our work, we raise those red flags and say, hey, this is going on, like, with climate change, right? Scientific community came in, they decided to, get together and say, we're in danger. Let's do something about it.
Exactly. But I also think that, so still climate science, like hard climate scientists, they can actually do that, right? They can say, okay, look, we understand, we take soil probes or something, and we understand how, the climate evolved over the last whatever 1,000 years, and we can exactly tell you what's going to happen if you don't stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere. But I think also for social scientists, it's really important that you get an idea of, okay, like how, for example, I'm not working on that personally, but other people are working on it. Okay, how do you induce behavioral change? How do you get politics to do something, right? So I think these things matter too, and that's coming from another slightly different angle, I guess. So
it's terrific. And especially thinking about it, we come in a lineage of scholars working on those issues. So in a Scholar Spotlight questionnaire, you mentioned an impressive list of people that you're interested in. So what influence have they had on your work?
So, when you asked the question in the questionnaire, I thought, okay, I had to think first. So the other questions I quickly answered, but for that one I had to think. I was like, okay, I mean, you always read stuff and you think about stuff. And I tried really hard to think about, okay, who do I really care about? And so while reflecting on that, I had the insight, let's say, that so there's not, I mean, of course, I don't know, if you're a Marxist, then probably Marx is really important for you or something like that. I don't have that really, but I think that I realized that when you start thinking about stuff, so when you go to university and you start, thinking really deeply about things that are going on in the world, at least that was the case for me, your thinking evolves over time, right? So you find, I don't know, this thinker really cool and he or she explains to the world and that's how the world is, right? And then at some point you read something else and then you meet people and discuss with people. And so I realized that in my, let's say, thinking, that changed a lot over the years, right? So I studied philosophy and I found some people really cool there. And then I studied politics and economics and that changed over time. So, and I think in the questionnaire I said like, what shapes my thinking today is, I guess, what was it, Marx, Cox, and Strange or something like that, right? Which is maybe not that surprising because I'm doing IPE, but I wouldn't say that I have something or someone who really influenced me in a way that I do what, so in the terms of a school or something like that, right? So that I do what someone has proposed to do, right? Like, again, if you're a Marxist or a whatever, a Lumanian, or I really have that.
A lens in a way.
Yeah.
Adopted. That's
yeah,
really
a lens.
good. So let's shift a bit and let's talk about policymaking. I think as policymakers, if they're listening to us, it would be really interesting because you mentioned the field should focus more on climate change in China. So given this, how do you envision policymakers making any changes when they hear about this research, and especially, two huge things, China and climate change. This is like on everybody's agenda right now. So what do you want policymakers to hear and what changes do you expect them to make? Big question.
Sure. So yeah, so the question or my answer regarding China and climate change was about the field itself, right? So where I think things are heading. So, but I think that's also pretty obvious. I think that's also not the case only for IPE, but especially maybe for IPE. And for policymakers, so I guess, so I don't know many policymakers. So I'm a bit hesitant to, to judging whatever they know and what they don't know. I mean, when I talk to people, when we do interviews, for example, for papers, and you get to talk to MPs or something, it's really interesting how much they know actually, right? So at least for me, that was surprising, right? So when you read the newspapers or something, you always get these like one-liners or something and short statements. But when you talk to people, you actually see, okay, they know something about their work, which maybe is obvious or not, I don't know. But in terms of what they might want to keep in mind or think about is that. So I think especially for foreign policy circles, if you think about China and the rise of China, I think, and that's also what other people are saying, right? So that's not just something that I make up. I think that a lot of people in the policy community, and let's say in the transatlantic sphere or so, they perceive China as this sort of unitary actor, right? And a lot of really good research in the last years has shown that that's actually not the case, right? So if you think about the stuff that I'm doing with Chinese SOEs, it's very different, right? So the governance of these entities is, all over the place. If you think about other, more foreign policy oriented aspects of China's rise, it's a very non-unitary actor, if you want. And I think that's important to realize. And Lee Jones and Shahar Harmeiri, they've just written. So I'm just reading the book that they written on, I think it's called Fractured or Fragmented China, Fractured China, I think, their argument, right, that I'm repeating here. And I think it's a really good book. So I'm halfway through, and it really shows how we can think about China, as this non-unitary actor. So I think that's something that policymakers should keep in mind. And for climate change, I mean, everything is on the table, right? There's not much I could add that that's not clear to everyone, from activists to politicians. So I think what we need is speed and determined action, and not thinking about whether what scientists have been predicting and what has been happening since 50 years plus is somehow not clear, or could be the other way around. That's not the case. So action is the main point here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking back about early career researchers, because I think most of them will be looking at this video. You, in your questionnaire, you have mentioned that we should try to find the people that would share the journey with us. And this is a terrific advice. And I think networking is really important. And I've been thinking about this question, and I think it would be unfair for me to ask, but I'm seeing those people coming in during a COVID-19 environment. I remember sitting down, drinking coffee with colleagues and sharing my research and having that experience. Do you think, and we've done a lot of, conferences online, we've done all of it online. Do you think it's much harder for them, especially when they're starting out, having, not having that connection, not having that, and how do they pursue it then? Because I don't know the answer to this myself, but
I think it's true, right? That so I didn't even think about this COVID angle when when I answered the question. Yeah, so I guess it's difficult, right? So there is, of course, networking is a term that I don't really like that much, because it sounds a bit like corporate speech always to me, right? So what I meant was more, okay, if you're a part of a department, or you do your PhD somewhere, there will be all sorts of people, right? Like everywhere in life, you'll have all sorts of different people, short and tall ones, and people you like and people you like less. And I think that at least from so again, that's not an advice, that's just a tip if you want, a cautious one, is that often people tend to perceive that too professional in a way. And I don't mean that you shouldn't be nice to your colleagues, but I think that's more than a job. Like every other job is more than a job, right? You always do it with people, and you're in these social contexts, and you care also about each other, after a while at least. And you're stuck with people for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years, how long your PhD takes. So I think it's, at least for me, it was really important to, get to know people on a personal level, also with people that I don't share any, let's say, professional interests, right? So people who do very different stuff than I do, and will never co-author or do something together, right? They're just friends. And I think that's important, right? So I understand that there is this sort of barrier often for people when they come into a new place, and especially if it's academia, you'll often feel, overwhelmed, and you'll think, okay, these are all whatever, very smart and successful people, but they're also just people, right? And so in that sense, my tip, if you want, was to look for this, or try to find this sort of social side of it. And that will help you, of course, in phases where things are a bit difficult, especially in a PhD. You will always have these phases. And so that was more about this. And I think that also works during COVID, right? Except if you have lockdowns, then nothing works. But then you have other problems, I guess. And for this early careers, it's important to get to know the people in your field. But I think these days that also works via, I don't know, email, Zoom. Also because this pandemic will be over at some point, and then you'll have the chance again to meet people. Yeah, so I think it's not a total game changer. At least, I mean, if I can say that, because I as you say, like the COVID started when I finished my PhD, so maybe that's also easy for me to say. But I think that these social aspects are, in your own department, that you get to know people, that you share your ups and downs with them. I think that's really
that's really important. I remember we had a breakfast with our PhD group every Monday or something. We would get together, do a breakfast, and just share ideas, share insights. And I think this is so valuable, having, as you said, this community to support you through ups and downs. And I think with COVID, it's really important to keep those connections going, even though they're virtual. It's really important to find time, do a quick Zoom or something, to really get to know the people in the department. So this is great. And a final question for you, Milan, because you put at the end 2 great books. I don't know where to start. So one of them is States versus Markets by Mark Schwartz, who I absolutely adore. He's such an amazing academic. And another one is Crash by Adam Tooze. So why did you pick those titles?
So Schwartz book, I guess I picked also, I don't know, because I know him
Yes.
personally. So here at Amsterdam, where I did my PhD, we were teaching that basically to, I think, third year bachelor students or something. And so every year, you know, the bookstore at the university was like, you saw it from the outside, right, was full of these books. And that was sort of funny because it was basically the course that, you know, where I was tutoring and basically the department was running it. So that was, we always sort of made a bit fun of that, right? So like every person in Amsterdam that studied knows who knows this book and knows who Mark Schwartz is. But I think in terms of, you know, understanding what this discipline is about, I think the book does one thing really good, which is that it combines a sort of macro historical perspective with what's going on the ground, right? So it has this economic history aspect to it. It has a lot of comparative elements, which is, I think, also important for students to understand, right? So that we learn through comparison, even though if you're not a comparative political scientist or political economist. And then, of course, this international or global aspect that, you know, of course, is because it's an IP book that has to be there. And he does it in a really engaging way, I think. It's also, I think, hard for students to get in, but if you're, let's say, I don't know, from another field and want to understand what's going on, I think that's a good way of getting into the field. And two is, of course, yeah, because he's an amazingly productive person, and not only productive, but what he's doing is, I think, really useful for communicating, of course, you know, macroeconomic effects and developments. But it's also very inspiring, I think, right? Because he's, I don't know, maybe he's like one of those last universal scholars, if you want, that we still have. So he's a historian, I think, actually, but he could also be I guess, a macroeconomist if you if you didn't know, right? And it's just super fun to read. I mean, if you read Crashed, you'll probably read it in 2 days or something. It's really, it has a lot of detail and it's really well written. And he has a certain way of communicating macroeconomic history, if you want, and developments in a really engaging way. So, and also all these other books, I guess. I haven't read the latest one, but yeah, I'm sure it's great. Get great reviews. It's about COVID, so short history of COVID, if you want.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that's why I picked them from the top of my head.
Those are amazing. I think everybody would. I'm just thinking about starting to read Adam Tooze's. I haven't read it yet, so I think.
Yeah, you should definitely. I mean, he has also a lot of articles in foreign policy, and so it's not only the book, of course.
Fantastic. Okay, looking forward to the whole list of readings from him. Milan, thank you so much for taking your time, for giving advice to early career scholars, for sharing your journey with us, and for giving policymakers something to think about. So I'm really happy that you're here. Yeah, thank you so much for taking your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was fun.
Thanks.